Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again in our series, Life, the Islamic Answer. We have discussed a number of topics until now, including the importance of knowledge, that ignorance and jahala, foolishness in Islam are not an option or an alternative. We spoke about the conditions of knowledge in Islam being action and sincerity. And we started to talk about the importance of acquiring knowledge, becoming someone who strives to gain knowledge. And then as soon as we gain a certain amount of knowledge, the responsibility that comes with sharing that knowledge to others and starting to fall in the position of the teacher or the scholar. We then started to talk about how now we have the two first ingredients to build a community of knowledge around. And apart from understanding the notion of community in Islam and the Holy Quran, we also started to look at what our religion tells us about this idea of community in general, and specifically with regards to a community of knowledge, of community of people who come together around the idea of acquiring and sharing knowledge. And we saw that the first, perhaps one of the most important questions we want to have is who belongs to this community and how does it work? We talked a little bit about some of the Islamic teachings around how a community works, how they meet and how often and what they discussed. And then we talked about who should belong to this community. And we said first and foremost, everyone. Everyone should find a role for themselves in that type of community of knowledge in Islam. And then we have a few categories of people that have been identified by our Islamic teachings as either deserving a special place and a special importance, or from our point of view, we need to discuss those because they are very relevant and we have questions and we have concerns and practical issues around these categories of people. So we want to see what our religion says about their presence in the community and their presence in the community of knowledge. And so that's when we talked about the importance of children belonging to the community of knowledge, which brought us to talking about the family belonging to the community of knowledge as a unit, women specifically, because there are misconceptions about women and knowledge in Islam. And we talked at the end about the role of the intellectual. And we have been discussing the role of the intellectual for perhaps around 10, 11, perhaps lectures, beginning with what has happened in the West over the past few centuries, let's call it the cultural, social, epistemological revolution that happened in the West, then led to wiping out the traditional ways of thinking, including religion, including the place of the church, including the place of monarchies, and replacing all of that with the system of science and rationality and humanism and democracy, and a complete rejection of everything that they called traditional up to that point, with the Enlightenment and with modernity. And we went through those cultural changes and the big milestones that happened in the West, leading all the way up to today. And we started to look at how, because of those changes, there is a new role that emerged that did not exist before, which is the intellectual. The figure of the intellectual appeared at that time as a central figure, because suddenly now you need new roles in society, new sources of knowledge, new sources of thinking, as opposed to the traditional ones where you knew exactly where to go. You had scripture that was given to you as an interpretation by the clergy, represented by the church that were working closely with the kings and queens, and you have a very clear structure in which you learn. When all of that was wiped out, they had to rethink entirely, where does knowledge come from, who holds it, who shares it, who teaches it, who learns it, and so on and so forth. And then we looked at the Islamic world and we saw that something similar, but also very different, happened in the Islamic world. But it happened with a delay, because the same changes that happened in the West were not replicated because Islam never had the type of rebellion against the traditional system as they had in the West, where you had societies basically rebel against the church and the state. At the same time, it was a rebellion against religion, or what represents religion in those societies. This never happened in Islam. There was never a rebellion against the religion and those who were presented in that way. But that said, the bigger changes, the other changes that took place, they were also reflected in addition to the changes that were now happening in the Islamic world, including, for instance, the extremely important event of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, World War I, World War II, the colonization of Islamic lands, the decolonization, the states, so those countries becoming countries after they were colonized, all of that we went through, we explained the big changes, and we said all of this leads us to where, before we start talking about the thinkers, the philosophers, and what they tried to do with the same question, after we went through all of the main thinkers in the West who talked about the figure of the intellectual and what they focused on, we wanted to now look at what the Muslim or Islamic thinkers are saying about the intellectual. We said, but before we say that, we have to understand the psychology and what they're trying to deal with, because it's completely different. In the West, they did not have this complex that they're trying to overcome. They're really trying to look at the figure of the intellectual objectively. In the Islamic world, they are dealing with what I call a complex. And the complex, you can call it a complex of superiority and inferiority. In short, they feel like the Islamic world fell. The civilization that it is represented by fell. There was a fall of the civilization of Islam. Islamdom, as they call it, fell, declined. And then one day you wake up and you find yourself very behind, completely dominated in multiple areas, the most important areas, especially militarily, but others, industrially, scientifically, economically. You are dependent, you're being dominated, you are unable to stand in a sovereign, empowered, independent way to defend yourself, to decide for yourself. So now all of these thinkers and intellectuals tried to understand who is the intellectual, what they should do, and what their role should be in that type of society. They're working against a background, and the background is we need a revival of Islam. We need to bring Islam back to its days of glory, that it is the religion based on which we can live our lives, that we are living lives of dignity, that we are empowered, that. So this idea of revival often also came with the idea of reform. There has to be something that changes so that we can go back to a revival and hope to see Islam come back to the way it is supposed to be. Now, I'm using the term Islam very loosely because most of them, though not all, most of them say the issue is not Islam. The issue is the Muslims who have, in fact, left Islam behind and not lived based on Islamic teachings for too long, and this was the result. But as we saw, this is not always the case. And this is where you start to see that the thinkers, when they are trying to propose a solution, they fall in different categories. One of the categories, and we didn't spend too much time on it because it's less of a concern to us, that our issue is not modernity for the sake of modernity. We're trying to bring all of this back to our own communities. The idea that they proposed in some groups, in some areas by some thinkers, that the way to revive Islam is simply to emulate the West and try to have the same type of break with Islam as they had in the West with Christianity. You want to worship, you want to have a religion, you want to be spiritual, this is an individual thing, keep it away. The movement towards secularism in the soft sense or the strong sense. There's a weak sense of secularism, there's a strong sense of secularism. So some Muslim thinkers or Islamic thinkers or thinkers in the Arab world, in the Middle East, and all of those areas that we were focused on, some of them said that's what's required, that complete break, because we saw that the Western model worked and they were able to advance and develop themselves through that. So we have to replicate that. And then you have those who say, absolutely not. We have to go back to our roots and just completely forget about the modern world and go back to the first generations of Islam and try to replicate and emulate them. This is the Salafist mentality. This is what Salafism means, that we go back to the first 3 or so generations of Muslims, so we will replicate them. And this is why you see that type of thinking even in the way I sit and the way I dress and the way I eat and the way I think. It's because I consider that time, that duration, those generations to be perfection. And everything that gets me away from that, pushes me away from that, is pushing me away from what the Holy Prophet tried to instill and create in the world. Okay, and so of course there's a way to look at this to say this is very narrow, this is very superficial understanding of what the Holy Prophet tried to do, but that was the solution on the other extreme. And then you have all of the spectrum in between. What do we take and what do we leave? And this is where we've focused the majority of our discussion until now, to show what the majority of the thinkers have been saying. And so we went through a large number of these thinkers until now. I'll just name a few, and then we'll go into the few that we have left to wrap up this and to, inshallah, introduce the Shi'i thinkers the next time that we meet. So we went through, for instance, scholars like Rifa' al-Tahtawi. We said he, for instance, emphasized educational reform. And this is now, we're talking in the 1800s. And we said we're talking about this, one, because a lot of these thinkers, I think it's important for us to know them and to know why their names are still being mentioned today. But more importantly, what themes seem to run across, and they seem to be common. And 2 centuries or more later, we hear major thinkers still repeating the same ideas, maybe a little bit more sophisticated, nuanced, modified, but the same themes are running through, which tells us maybe that we have never really been able to fix those things that were mentioned 2.5 centuries ago and until today. We still are running with the same issues, or at least it tells us that these are the major areas where we should focus on if every thinker who tackles the problem comes to the same conclusion. Or at the end, you have only a few themes that keep re-emerging. Doesn't this tell us something about our state and where we need to focus? So we spoke about Rifa' al-Tahtawi, we spoke about Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, his influence on a few of the other scholars and his ideas around unity, around educational reform, and a few others, and I'll come back to him quickly, inshallah, the next time perhaps that we meet, inshallah. We spoke about Muhammad Abda and his student Rashid Rida, the importance that they gave to starting to put together ways of combining the different types of knowledge, Islamic with non-Islamic knowledge, to create not only new types of people in society, but new scholars. Because here, Muhammad Abda, we're talking about an Azhari trained scholar at the highest level of his scholarship as a Muslim scholar, saying the scholars we are producing today are no match for the challenges of modernity. We need to rethink how we educate the scholars. Forget the laymen and the commoners and what we do with our... Of course, he put a lot of energy into that too, but the main focus was we have to start from the top and focus on the scholars. We spoke about Sayyid Qutb and the influence that he had on that type of world, and where he started to focus on this idea of the intellectual in that world. He called them the Pali'ah, right? Those who are at the forefront, who are fighting the first fight. How do we educate them? What do we equip them with knowledge, and so on and so forth? And his influence is still present until today for sure. We spoke about Muhammad Iqbal. We talked about his importance as a successful thinker himself and a successful intellectual himself in multiple fields, in philosophy and as a poet and as a politician, as a thinker. And this gave a lot more credence to the ideas because he seems to be successful in the areas that he's talking about. He knows what he's talking about, and now he's in a position where he has to balance all of these ideas with the reality and try to lead a society and manage the affairs of a nation. So how is he going to do it, and what are his ideas? So extremely influential there. We spoke about Malik ibn Nabi, unfortunately not well enough known in our circles, a North African thinker. A lot of his ideas were way ahead of their time. He spoke a lot about the idea that we seem to have a mind that is colonizable. That was his idea. Why is our mind producing people, producing us, people who carry that type of mind, that type of thinking that makes us colonizable, that invites others to colonize us and to use us and to exploit us? Where where did we go wrong in our thinking? What do we need to change and purify and cleanse so that we move back to being sovereign and being independent and having integrity and having dignity, right? And so a lot of, deep thinking there. We spoke about al-Jabari, Muhammad Abid al-Jabari, extremely influential, if not the most influential thinker of the past couple of generations in the, that type of thinking in the Islamic world. And those who kind of reacted to him, George Tarabishi, Adonis, Ali Harb, they are prolific writers. And so it's a back and forth. He writes, they answer, that he answers to their, and so on and so forth. That creates a whole tradition around that. We spoke about Abdul Wahab al-Masiri, we spoke about Hassan Hanafi, we spoke about Taha Abdul Rahman wa al-Hallaq. And then we moved to, last time we met, we spoke about Malcolm X and how he views the role of the intellectual and what he's trying to create in the communities where he was influencing, and how his views broadened after he went to Hajj and his ideas about Islam suddenly changed. Islam is not just about what we're trying to do with, the black African American living in the US. It's about an ummah living across the globe. That's completely different thinking. So what do we need to do? And it's about awareness and education and understanding how we are being exploited and then doing something about it. We spoke about some major thinkers where we started to draw again some common themes, including Fadl al-Rahman, or Fazl al-Rahman, as he writes his name, the famous Pakistani thinker who left Pakistan, Indian Pakistani. He left there and came to the US because there was a severe backlash against some of his writings and how he called for a reinterpretation of the Holy Quran using modern tools. And we said this starts to become a common theme. Those are thinkers who have been educated in more Western, more modern ways of interpreting texts and understanding texts, as they call it, the historical critical approach, hermeneutics, the plurality of meanings and philosophy, and so on and so forth. So they say if we start to use some of these tools, we will generate new knowledge. And that new knowledge will allow us to deal with the challenges of today. We can't keep relying on the same tools and the same type of knowledge that we have had in the past. It does not allow us to find answers to the problems of today. Those tools were good for the problems of that time. That's why they developed those tools. We need new tools today. So Fadl al-Rahman definitely went very far in his idea of what the intellectual should do, that they must engage with the Islamic tradition in a modern way, that they should add the ethical dimension to everything that they do, and he called it, this is very important, I think, for all of us to keep in mind, the idea that the intellectual has to have what he called deep and holistic understanding of the whole Quran, right? So you do not understand a part of the Quran and ignore another, or apply a part, and you have to understand where every teaching of the Quran fits into the big picture, and you apply the spirit of the religion to the challenges and the problems that you're trying to face. And he says, including, you have to add to that historical consciousness. You understand where you fit in, you understand the bigger context, the ethical vision, and what he called Maqasid al-Sharia, which is a huge topic. We'll talk about it more perhaps, I don't know if in this series or in future series, but this is understanding the main higher level objectives behind the laws and the teachings of religion, right? So that religion, according to this theory, is not giving you a teaching for the sake of that specific teaching. It's giving you a teaching for the sake of a higher purpose. So if we understand what the higher purposes are, then we know what needs to be modified to achieve those, given time and space, given the context and circumstances in which we live. And he wanted to use a little bit of that. And of course, this had huge impact on other thinkers too, because he gave you a lot of the tools and a lot of the thinking, and others applied it. So very influential that way. We spoke about Muhammad Arkoun, the other one who also did something similar from another tradition. So he went at it more from the, as we said, he's an Algerian working in France and that kind of world. So he's reacting to the colonization of Algeria and that thinking, but still trying to do the same thing, reinterpreting the Sunnah, reinterpreting the Quran, using modern tools to achieve that. And his influence is still very clear today on many, many thinkers who try to do the same without perhaps saying we are taking or applying directly Muhammad Arkun. And we mentioned two of them last time, one of them being Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, a very famous Egyptian linguist, philosopher, who had to escape to leave Egypt, where he was working, because he was declared apostate, murtad, for some of his views, where he was trying to show how the Quran needs to be reinterpreted and so on and so forth. And from there, the idea of what an intellectual should be in society, and the link with human rights and fighting for freedom of speech and so on and so forth. And we also talked about Tariq Ramadan, and we finished with Tariq Ramadan, where we said, a lot of what he says perhaps maybe not new in substance, but the way he puts it together is extremely clear, extremely relevant. And he was perhaps the most prominent thinker, especially post 9/11, in the European media, especially in France, in the French language media in France, Belgium, Switzerland, and then, the Islamic world, Africa, and elsewhere. And he, of course, sometimes intervenes in English, but mostly in French. And he took a lot of these ideas, talked about the importance of reform, the importance of knowing our identity, what it means to be a Western Muslim living in the West. This is a different identity than a Muslim living in the East, for instance, and so on and so forth. And he also talked about the need for having intellectuals, the need for the reform to be from within Islam, not outside of it, critiquing it or criticizing it from the outside, the importance of Muslims being active and engaged and present in the societies in which they live, not live in ghettos, in cultural ghettos, in isolation from society, just seeing each other and interacting with each other, to be present. And he spoke specifically about the intellectuals having to have a duty again towards tradition on the one side, and towards the societies in which they live on the other side. So they must understand, preserve, and reinterpret their own tradition, and they must contribute to the constructive critique of the societies they live in, and the production of new meanings for these societies, because they have something to contribute. This is where we stopped. So this is a quick recap, and we continue, inshallah, today with three thinkers. The first one is Aliya Izetbegović. This is a major thinker, a little bit like Muhammad Iqbal, in the sense that this is someone who is engaged, who is thinking, who has ideas and theories, and with time, he actually becomes a politician, and then he becomes the statesman, the person who is going to lead a state and a country. So he was a Bosnian thinker, a political activist, a politician, and he became the first president after the dissolution or the fragmentation of Yugoslavia, of Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? And when he, in his youth, started to become active, you start to already see that he has a lot of awareness of what it means to be a Muslim living in that type of world. So he's living in Yugoslavia under a communist regime. He knows what atheism is, secularism is, communism is, ethnic wars, the Balkan wars, and he starts to get engaged with a group of Muslims, other Muslims, to do humanitarian work in areas that are struck by poverty and other issues that you find in areas of war. So he gets imprisoned a first time because of that. And then he is released. And in 1970, he writes the declaration, his declaration called the Islamic Declaration. So this is his manifesto, basically. The idea of how Muslims can come together to create for themselves a political presence in a modern world, in the realities that they are facing. What does it mean, and how does it come together, and why is this important and necessary to do? He gets imprisoned for this, and he's sentenced 14 years in prison. And he is released before he does maybe a little bit less than half of that time. As soon as he comes out, he creates a political party. and he gets very directly involved in politics. He becomes a politician at that time, and he wants to unite Muslims and to have a Muslim presence. And this is, by the way, what starts. We're talking about the war in Bosnia. So anyone who knows, recent history and the wars in that region, what happened in Bosnia was, atrocious and horrific. From the outside, they simply say there's a civil war going on. But really, there's a genocide going on. It's a complete destruction of an entire people or peoples at that time. And so he's dealing directly with that. Finally, he becomes the president of that area, and he has to deal with those wars. And that did not end right away. There was a siege of the capital, and it was a whole, I don't want to go through the history of the Bosnia wars, but at the end, he is left with a completely broken country that he has to rebuild. He had, influence and presence and respect at the European Union and the United Nations. And during this whole time, he is talking about the importance of the Muslim identity and what it means to be a Muslim society and how to create a society that is just based on Islamic teachings. This is extremely powerful and extremely influential. And until today, if you read his writings, you see that it has a lot of depth and a lot of maturity because the issues he's dealing with are very complex. And he's maintaining that Islam is the answer here. We can achieve results and achieve success and develop ourselves and protect our identities and change the world and deal with all of this horrific reality through Islam. And so this is extremely powerful. The better you understand what he's contending with and what he's dealing with, the more you appreciate his writings, because you see that he's not talking in a vacuum. He's not a thinker sitting, alone in comfort in front of a computer writing away, right? This is someone who is dealing with a very harsh reality in life. So he was very known for relying on Islamic heritage, Islamic philosophy to address real political issues, social issues. And so he says that politics is not a choice that you just make, a luxury that you can have. Politics is a responsibility. We have to step into the political arena and to have presence and to have action and a voice and presence there. And it must be done, politics, because that's always a problem with politics, that it's supposed to be dirty. The moment you get in, you have to be ready to get involved. He says it must be done with ethics and with spirituality. And if I can summarize a lot of what he talks about, it's about showing that Islam, a true understanding of Islam, is the only way to achieve balance in life. No matter what you look at in life, you see that the issue is a lack of balance. It's too much or too little. Going too far in one side, not going far enough on the other side. And Islam is the middle path. And so if you read one of his main works, is called Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. It's something like Between East and West. I think it's called Islam, Between East and West. And the idea is that it has multiple meanings. When you say Islam between East and West, like stuck between East and West, or, you have the East that's going too far in some things, it's going too far east. You have the West, and then you have the middle path. It's the third way. It's the same thing that we find in the different ways of looking at it, but the writings of some of our scholars, when they talk about, if you look at capitalism and you look at communism or socialism and what they present as economic systems, and that you have the one that is balanced in between, that is the Islamic system, for instance. Otherwise, the two go too far or too little in the different important aspects. In any case, so he talks a lot about the role of the intellectual, that they have to be the bridge between what is political and the reality of the world and what is sacred. And this is a very interesting way of looking at it. So they must preserve, they are the ones who help preserve cultural identity, unite science and spirituality, reason and revelation. They have to engage with modernity, but in a critical manner, so that you do not lose your Islamic foundations while knowing how to take and integrate from modernity where it makes sense, avoid traditionalism, and unquestioned secularism. So he's being critical on both sides, right? The intellectuals are those who speak up. He says, if you look at societies where there are people who are being oppressed, those who speak up are the true intellectuals. So he says the intellectual always comes with an ethical responsibility. They are the ones who understand what is going on, and they have the courage to speak up and defend the rights of the weak. And they were the ones, he says, during the wars that we witnessed, they were the ones stepping up during communist oppression, during ethnic violence, genocide in Bosnia. It was the intellectuals who rose against passive knowledge. So he says to call something Islamic knowledge and then not act with that knowledge, bringing it back to what we talked about, action being the second condition of knowledge in Islam. He says passive knowledge cannot be Islamic knowledge. Islamic knowledge means a call to action. You are always doing something with that knowledge. So against the idea of passive knowledge, he says Islamic knowledge is a living force. It fights for social justice. It fights against colonialism, poverty. It must lead to cross-civilizational dialogue. And it allows these societies, these communities to have confidence and to have an identity. And so all of this needs, he says, a new education system to produce people who think in this way and who know what to do without it. And none of this is possible without having what he calls an intellectual elite. Brings us back to common themes, right? That's why I say if you read through, you start to see the common themes emerge. So this intellectual elite has to be rooted in Islamic tradition as well as modern thought. They have to be experts in both. They have to understand the historical and the political realities of the Muslims amongst whom they live in the Islamic world, and work to re-Islamize, keep this word in mind, re-Islamize society through ethics, morality, not authoritarianism. You cannot force people into any of this. They have to see it, they have to believe it, and they have to act by themselves towards it. Okay, so that's Aliya or Aliya Izetbegović. The two last thinkers, quickly, they go together. And they, each one of them in their own way, produced a notion that is extremely still powerful today, but we have to think about it and see what that means. These would be very rich topics for good discussion and good conversation and thinking. And this is the notion of the Islamization of knowledge, Islamic ulum, as they call it, to make knowledge Islamic. What does that mean? So I'll present the two main thinkers around it. Today, there are many, many other names that we could add to these, but these are the two founders of this idea. Okay, and I won't talk too much about the relationship, if there is, and from their lives, you'll understand that they are in two parts of the world. They're working on different sets of issues, but they're coming to the same conclusion again, which is, to me, again, very interesting and very telling, and we need to think about this. The first one is Ismail al-Faruqi. So he's a Palestinian-American thinker, philosopher. He grew up in Palestine. His father was a judge, and then he went to Lebanon, and then he came to North America to continue his studies. He got his PhD, and already there you could see that even though his studies were in philosophy, he was very interested in knowledge, so epistemology and knowledge, as well as ethics, right? So he's looking at the ethical models of Kant and other thinkers, other philosophers. And initially, a lot of his influence came from the work that he had done and those who had affected him, especially because of his studies. He studied with the Christians in the monasteries, and that system was very influenced by the idea of Arabism. And I spoke a little bit about it when I spoke about what was going on in the big milestones and the attempts to reform and revive the Islamic world. One of the ideas was Arabism. So this is happening in the same time. This was not the first time, but he's influenced by that. The idea that if you are able to bring people back and unite them around a language, you unite them around the idea that they all speak the same language, which creates their identity, which is Arabic, then you are able to regenerate the revival that you're looking for in Islam. Because traditionally and historically, this is what allowed the Muslim world to come together. This is what united the people. It was a common language because of the Quran, right? So But he adds to that saying the real contribution of the Arabs to the world, and he's very involved, by the way, in interfaith studies, and he was very known for that because he has a bit of a background, right? When he is taught by Christians. And so when he comes, he continues that work and he studies Judaism, he studies Christianity, and he says the main contribution of the Arabs to the world is the notion of Tawheed today with Islam, the version that Islam presented to the world, which is present in all the religions. And so this is a common thread across the three religions, and we have to continue the dialogue. But this, so he says Arabism, if I can call it that, is two things. It's not just a language, it's linguistic and theological. You're presenting Tawheed and a language to the world. And this is what unites all the Muslims around the world. But already when he comes to the US, he starts to be confronted with a reality. I'm not going to go through the details of his life. He gets confronted to the reality that he needs to study Islam in a lot more depth. And so what does he do? He goes to Cairo and he spends 4 years or 5 years studying in Al-Azhar University to have a traditional, solid understanding, background, in depth about traditional Islamic knowledge. And then he comes back and he teaches in the US, in Canada, and then Fadlur Rahman, about whom we spoke before, he created through his connections a position for him, and he went and taught in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. And this, by the way, broadened his understanding of what it means to be a Muslim, because this is a very different type of Muslim than the ones he was seeing before. In any case, and so as we said, he does his work and he starts to think very seriously about the idea of, once again, what does it mean to create a just society? Okay, what does a just society look like? Working on interfaith dialogue, or what he calls meta-religion. What are the things higher than a specific religion that are common to all religions? Let's focus on those to create a dialogue between religions, and so on and so forth. So he focuses a lot on the notion of Tawheed. He goes very far in saying basically that's the summary and the synthesis of the entirety of our faith and our religion of Islam. But the more he studies the other disciplines to try to integrate all of this work together, the more he starts to be confronted to a reality that they're supposed to all fit coherently together in a logical way, but they don't. These disciplines don't end up being where we need them to end up. And the reason is because they're not Islamic. And we try to integrate them with Islamic knowledge, and we start to see that there's a clash. There's something that doesn't work. So what do we need to do? He says, we need to first come to the realization that modern knowledge is not compatible with Islamic knowledge. We need to rethink Islamic knowledge. We need to create a way of understanding knowledge that is entirely Islamic, because we can't try to make it work and integrate it with the types of knowledge that exist in the modern world. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that in more detail in a second with the other thinker that I want to talk about. Western sciences, he says, are disconnected from ethics. They are disconnected from Tawheed. And Islamic knowledge is all about the ethical dimension of Tawheed. You cannot put them together. You have to rethink what it means to have knowledge, how to acquire it, and how to use it. And so therefore, Islam cannot rely on Western tools and Western methodologies and call it Islamic knowledge. That is not possible. So he spent the rest of his career working on the notion of the Islamization of knowledge, taking knowledge and making it Islamic. So at the epistemological level and the methodological level, what does it mean to have Islamic knowledge? And so he started to apply this to different things. For instance, he talks about the importance of understanding how zakah, which can be understood economically, also has as a charity, it has an ethical dimension to it. And this applies to all the teachings in Islam, which you don't find elsewhere. So it's going to be a lot more one-dimensional elsewhere. But here you have multiple dimensions. You have the economic dimension, but it comes already including the social dimension and the ethical dimension and the Tawheed dimension ingrained and wired into them. Right? You don't need to add anything to it to make it work, and so on and so forth. So let's do this to all of the knowledge. He puts together something called the International Institute for Islamic Thought, the IIIT, which still exists today in 1981, that is dedicated to this question and to this idea. So we have to critique Western knowledge. We have to reanalyze knowledge in general to see how to make it Islamic. We have to create Islamic education programs focused on Quran and Tawheed. We have to do research on the different disciplines to see how do we make them Islamic. How do we create an Islamic economy? How do we create an Islamic sociology? How do we create an Islamic history? How do we create an Islamic psychology? And so on and so forth. Okay, with time, they started to use other terms, by the way. If you read more modern writings from them, because he died, he was killed. Now they call it the integration of knowledge or the unity of knowledge, but it's all the same idea of the Islamization of knowledge. And perhaps it's to distinguish from the thinking of the other thinker too, who talked about the same thing. Okay, so the idea at the end is that we are producing scholars who are able to deal with the challenges of the modern world. So we're coming back to the same themes and the same ideas. And in 1986, he was assassinated in his home in the United States. He was killed, his wife was killed, and they tried to kill his daughter who was pregnant at the time living with them, but she didn't die. And the case remained unsolved. They said, we are not sure why this happened, but many people believe that he was a very, very open critic of Zionism. He has a book about it and so on and so forth. And so there's a very direct link of perhaps what happened there and who attacked him and who eliminated him in 1986. So extremely influential thinker. And in today's world, there is still work happening with the institute that he founded and the ideas that he put in place. He was prolific. He wrote, I think, over 25 books and a good 100 articles or more, which is a lot in the university world. And he has a lot of reach, academically speaking, very, very influential thinker. And this idea of the Islamization of knowledge, I would say he carries half of that, the credit today of that idea. Who's the other half? Perhaps more well known because he wasn't killed much younger, okay? And it's Syed Muhammad Naquib al-Attas. So he's a scholar, a thinker, a philosopher from Malaysia. And he lived in the post-colonial state of that country. And so he understands what it means to be colonized. You see that running through a lot of his thinking, but he starts to apply this idea of being colonized, not only to the typical way of being colonized. My economy is colonized, my politics are colonized, my culture is colonized. He says my knowledge is colonized. I'm forced to think using the tools of others. These are not my tools of thinking. So it's not producing the right type of knowledge. And so the world in which we live and the way that we try to create our meaning in the Islamic world is in crisis. We are unable to think Islamically. Using the tools that we have, these modern tools are tools that come to us from atheism, from materialism. They do not have ethics. They have moral relativity, right? It's not absolute. It's not right and wrong. Everything may be right. Everything may be wrong. It's completely relative. There's spiritual confusion. There is loss of purpose. All of this is not compatible with the Islamic worldview. And so the Islamic world is in crisis because of this. So again, the idea of how do we revive the entirety of the Islamic world comes back to knowledge. And how do we produce knowledge that is Islamic? He says we cannot inject Islamic content into non-Islamic disciplines. You can't take the Western version of psychology and inject Islamic notions into it and call it Islamic psychology. That's not Islamic psychology. These two don't go together, they're contradictory. And for instance, Quranic verses to economics, and now you call it Islamic economy. That's not enough. And so we must reconstruct the foundations, he says, of our entire thinking. All knowledge has to be reconsidered and rethought. Main ideas, Tawheed. Again, the notion of Tawheed, you see how every thinker comes back to Tawheed as the synthesis of this religion. He calls it adab. Adab is the combination of morality and ethics. And so he goes very far in how Muslims are ingrained with this because of the teachings of Islam that is non-existent in Western teaching. It's not that you are just informed by knowledge, you are formed by knowledge, right? It molds you, it changes you, this knowledge that you acquire, whereas in the West, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? And I'm going to come back to that point. Otherwise, it leads to the state of the world, which is a misuse of knowledge, because knowledge doesn't transform you. It just gives you tools to act. Whereas Islamic knowledge transforms you from within. It changes who you are. The hierarchy of being has to be retaught. So we understand that there's God and then creation and human beings who are the most responsible of creation. So there's a responsibility that comes with it, and knowledge and ethics are integrated into all of this. So we must therefore cleanse all knowledge from secularism, materialism, skepticism, which is very important. No one talks about this. Maybe in the future we'll talk more about it. So specifically for the intellectual. So the intellectual is the one who has been fully formed by entirely Islamic knowledge. So now we have to then get back to, the beginning and create Islamic knowledge. Correcting, this is the main role, correcting the confusion of knowledge. This is the role of the intellectual. The confusion of the knowledge in the present world has to be corrected by the intellectual, who acts as a guide and educator. Critically analyze and purify foreign ideas before integrating them together, ensuring and restoring coherence, purpose, the logic between them, so that they all go in the direction of Tawheed and Islamic teachings. And you defend Islamic metaphysics against secularism, materialism, and so on and so forth, without ever becoming a tool of power and a tool of ideology, which is very important. And it's an indirect or direct way of, talking about the role of these thinkers and these elites and these intellectuals in different societies and how they are used by the state and so on and so forth. So reestablish a view of knowledge that is sacred. So knowledge is sacred, reality is sacred, everything created by God is sacred, everything that leads back to God is sacred. So you view it differently, as opposed to it's just information and you learn it and you go do whatever you want with it. Mastering, the importance of mastering both Islamic sciences and contemporary disciplines. And this has come back again and again and again in every thinker. They want to talk about it and be an intellectual, go learn Islam and master it, and go learn the modern disciplines and master them. And you are then in a position to start integrating and showing how these go together in the modern world, resisting both Western mimicry and anti-intellectual populism, because he is dealing with societies that are against intellectualism, right? So he says, no, this also has to be fought. We have to resist that and change it. We have to be open to being intellectual. And a lot of his writing, and you see that come back again and again, but that's important to know. So basically his main figures as role models are al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, al-Farabi. He talks about them. And I'm not going to say awkward, but we've seen a lot of the intellectuals attack, especially some of the Egyptian thinkers, attack Sufism, because they said that this is one of the reasons why we have fallen as a civilization. He defends Sufism. And this is, his defense is really to show that there's a very heavy, rich dimension in Islam that has been pushed even more exaggerated in Sufism, but it's there. So when you look at it, it teaches you a lot about what this religion is about. And he has a background in Sufism too, but that's another topic. They're initially, by the way, his name is Syed Muhammad Naquib al-Attas. In truth, they are originally from Yemen, but they moved to Malaysia and they stayed there for a while. Anyways, very influential books and very influential thinker. And there is work today happening in the ITSAC, so the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. So this is comparable to the IIIT of Faruqi. This is the version of it. Al-Attas, if you want to see the extension of that work until today, it continues until today, maybe in a couple of minutes. So this idea of the Islamization of knowledge. There is a lot of arguments for it, and there are also some strong arguments against it. Okay, so I leave you with that, just so that we think about it, because as I said, this is still an ongoing debate in the Islamic world, and for us to think about too, what does it mean? Do we actually need to Islamize knowledge or not? Is it even possible to Islamize knowledge or not? And how does it work? If we wanted to, where do we start and how does that work? So for it, they say that, those who are entirely for it, they say that Muslims and the world suffers If this does not happen, because knowledge and therefore people become fragmented, become confused, become pulled in by different ideologies that are contradictory and inconsistent with each other. And the only way to make them consistent and coherent is bring them back to Islam and Islamic foundation and rethink all of these disciplines. So secularism, materialism, whereas Islamization is going to unify our worldview into one clear idea or set of ideas that have a specific direction, right? Modern knowledge systems are simply not compatible with the Islamic paradigm, they say. So if you're a Muslim, you simply say this does not work, period. The more you study it, the more you understand this. So therefore, the need to restore the Islamic worldview in our societies and so on and so forth. We have to rethink the disciplines. We have to train scholars. We have to create education programs, education systems. So the focus has been here on the humanities, for instance, on sociology. And you see that throughout. Like even thinkers, maybe next week we'll talk about him. We've talked about him earlier, but we'll come back to him. Ali Shariati, for instance, he says, the importance that we develop our own sociology and our own psychology. He talks about this. So this is the same idea. We have to have our own, they say, psychology, sociology, history, some have said political science, and so on and so forth, getting rid of what he calls al-Attas, Western colonization, but a Western colonization of our thinking and the tools of knowledge that we use, and this will lead to a knowledge sovereignty or a knowledge empowerment. Okay, so what is the system? And that's really my way of putting it, if I had to make the argument for this. When you look at the Western system of knowledge, what does it try to produce? It produces producers or agents and consumers in an economic system. That's how the knowledge system in the world is built, especially in the West. It produces people who participate in an economic machine. You know your place, you have the tools, you have what you need to be part of an economic machine so that you can produce for others and you can consume what others produce. Islam is not trying to do that. Islam is trying to produce servants of God. Very, very different paradigm. So all the knowledge that you get in Islam is supposed to feed into that, as opposed to feeding an economic machine. Is it against economy? No, but that's not the purpose. It will allow or include the economy part or economy dimension, as well as all the others. But that's not the main driver behind the system that is put in place. In any case, on the other side, the project has also been very, very criticized. For instance, some have questioned the very idea of having an Islamic version of knowledge. Knowledge is supposed to be truth. There are facts about the world. So is your physics going to be different from my physics, and your math is going to be different than my math? If we go back in history, did the West not just take our knowledge and apply it? Did not the Muslim world have the same version of math that they came and took and applied? And they were able to go further with it because we stopped producing and they continued? So is there really an Islamic version or not? So of course, I'm not taking a position here. I'm just saying what the main arguments are in each one of these. If you dig into them, you see perhaps there is no contradiction, right? In any case, the other idea is that why have we not seen? So this all happened especially around the 80s. The idea of the Islamization of knowledge with institutions and think tanks behind it. Why have we still not seen the Islamic version of any of these sciences? How long does it take to produce this knowledge? Show me really coherent, fully cooked, polished version of Islamic economy, Islamic psychology, Islamic sociology. Where is it? Why are we waiting for it? And where is the aspect of it that we should perhaps be concerned with if we want to push our societies economically, industrially, militarily, practically speaking? The natural sciences, the math and the computer and the chemistry and the biology and does that apply to it as well or not? Because the claim initially was that it applies to all, but everything we see coming out seems to be focused on the humanities. So maybe you need to already define where this applies and where does this not apply. In any case, so until now, the main issue seems like there has been a lack of methodology. You have to be able to tell me here are the steps you follow to Islamize knowledge or to produce Islamic knowledge from scratch, for instance. This has not been the case, which means that it either will not work because you're not able to make it real and break it down to the steps, or you haven't thought about it enough. The ideas are still not mature enough. We need more generations of thinkers to go in that direction, even though some say, this is hopeless and let's stop wasting time and money and effort and energy and resources on this. And some have also even said that this is just going to help religion. So you can think of people like Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid and his likes, saying that it's just going to make religion perhaps overstep and give more authority to religion because you're calling everything religion and religious science and Islamic science. In what way? In the sense that, if we want to be sophisticated in the argument, we say that perhaps religion was not meant to address everything. Religion was perhaps only meant to address things that it addressed, and it left the rest for human beings to deal with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you tools to go and figure out and understand and explore and study and test and experiment and reach your own conclusions and then fix those conclusions. And this is how science works. It didn't need to come and give you revelation about this. You don't need to come back and call it Islamic. There's nothing Islamic about it. Those things that are Islamic, it told you. It added them. There's verses in the Quran. There are well-known ahadith that talk about it because those are the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala either wants you to focus on as being revelation coming from Him, or the things you could never know by yourself. Because the human mind is incapable of knowing, for instance, what happens in the afterlife in detail. So you have to have some other source of knowledge for it, and that's where you get your knowledge from the revelation. The rest Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the tools for. So this starts to create a different vision or understanding of what religion is. Does it cover absolutely everything, or does it focus on the areas that are specifically related to your spiritual salvation, and the rest says it's up to you. You can live your life the way you want, so long as this part is well understood and you follow the teachings that I have given you. In any case, I'll stop here. Inshallah, the next time that we meet, we can start talking about to wrap this topic. And by popular demand, we'll wrap this topic by complementing it with a few Shi'i thinkers and their attempts at looking at the role of the intellectual to wrap up this topic. And then we move on to the next headings, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli. Maybe a couple of minutes for questions. Otherwise, we leave it maybe after prayer.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, the speech. It was very, very useful. Just to pick up where you left off, with regard to, the Sunni thinkers and or scholars. So from your lectures and also from what I've studied so far, even like the scholars who appear to be very critical of, how the Islamic world has evolved and how it should have evolved, one thing is very clear that they're very point of reference based on. They never question that. And what they think about what Islam
Yes.
is basically not Islamic itself, right? And that's very frustrating to see that the entire Sunni world is failing to produce thinkers who can go back. We have seen like people like al-Maududi or others who go as far as like questioning Mawiya and the um, uh, Maluki system or whatever that is, where they change the Khilafah system, right? Um, but then they fail to go, further than that, to Sapipa, for example, right? Where, you know, like the people from the time of Jahiliyyah took over together with the hypocrites and changed the very face of Islam, right? And that has basically changed the whole purpose of Islam into a materialistic, worldly thing. And they're trying to reconcile, that distorted version of Islam with the modern world, which both have the same problem, right? And so that's something that I hadn't seen in any of the. Are there some scholars who have addressed this, or
It's an excellent question and very accurate description. And in short, the way I think you want them to address it, no, it has not been addressed, not to my knowledge. And so, if you mean in the Sunni world, those who will be critical of those earlier generations that will say, the wrong turn happened even earlier than we're saying, they will be very critical of religion in general because to them that's one. And this is, I think, the point you're making, or the conclusion that we should all arrive to, is that they're not able to dissociate between religion and what happened to the Islamic community right from the time of the passing away of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So to them, that's one thing, one continuum, and then there was a wrong turn taken. So those who have talked about a wrong turn a little bit more openly, they say, for instance, it was with Muawiyah that he turned it into a kingdom, bringing in Bani Umayyah, and the turn was there. Others say, for instance, no, it was much later by Bani al-Abbas or the end of Bani al-Abbas, right? But they will not be very critical of anything else, right? So the way you want from the Sunni world, I don't think is there. From the Shia world as well, as I'll mention, there are very, very few thinkers who have even talked about this idea of the intellectual, or how uh, we should move towards a revival and a reform and all of that, which is perhaps another issue to talk about, and needs to be talked about, because are we concerned with this, or are we in isolation and it doesn't concern us? That's the question, right? And in any case, I will address that a little bit the next time we meet, inshallah, but you'll see that there is very little of that. Those who talk about this issue will talk about it from aqaid or history perspective. They will not talk about it from this angle that you just addressed, which is there is an intellectual revolution that is required, a reform that is required. How do we link it to an ideal, if the ideal never existed in the Islamic world because it took the wrong turn from the beginning and we were never able to put it back on the rails as we should have been, right? That's the main argument there. And I haven't seen it. Maybe it exists, but I haven't seen it. I've seen it, but not in this type of writing. It exists in the books of Apartheid, it exists in the books of Sira, but not in the books of thaqafa, culture, philosophical thinking about the state of the Islamic world today and what needs to happen as a reform. That's it. There was a question or a comment?
No, I was just thinking like because I missed the previous lectures, so I wanted to see the application of because the current society doesn't have much thinkers and philosophers, right? So what are the implications moving forward if we continue the same path for our society, and what could happen like if you don't reform, have an intellectual reform?
You mean Islamically? So do you mean society as in like us living here, or do you mean when you're living in a Muslim majority world?
Well, I meant us as a society, as a Muslim society, regardless of us living here or in the East, in the Middle East. But just as a Muslim society, what would happen? Like, what are the implications if not having a societal reform from an intellectual perspective?
The short and clear outcome that is tangible right now is that the more our lives are getting complex, and the pace of change is moving faster and faster, the more the newer generations, because they did not grow up with what the previous generation grew up with, and so now the distance is even greater, the more the newer generations will feel that the religion has nothing to do with reality. And so you will have people who will want religion because it's kind of an individual thing that I do all alone between myself and my Lord, but it has nothing to do with real life because it's outdated and it cannot even keep up with the real ideas. And then you will have people who will just say it's not relevant. Like, I don't even need it for the individual dimension. To me, this is there's a lot of other things we can say, but this is the biggest one that is tangible and clear to all. That if this religion is not able to show that it can be present in the modern times by dealing with issues that affect people's lives directly, individually and as societies, then it's irrelevant. And people will do what they want with that, but it's irrelevant. So some will make it very limited. It's relevant to me in this space, just like you have in the West and elsewhere, right? So it's relevant in that way. It helps me. I can find meaning, comfort. I deal with grief, sadness, problems in life all alone. I pray, but it has nothing to do with real day-to-day life. Or you completely even reject that part. I think that's the tangible, concrete, practical outcome that we're moving very quickly towards. There are movements of revival, but those ideas are perhaps not addressed. There are other things contributing and helping. When in the West, the systems that they have put in place collapse, then suddenly you say, okay, well, maybe the alternative is not there. But it doesn't fix the problem that what I have, does it deal with it or not? That's still an issue. So I say it helps that the other system that was supposed to be the answer is failing. Then you say, okay, I can't go there, but I know that what I have here is not doing it either. Right? That's the issue. But in any case, that's for another discussion, for much bigger discussion. Yeah. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.